Well, thanks for coming. That was very nice. I'm going to keep these remarks somewhat brief. The basic theme that I have to say about counterinsurgency is this, that first of all, it really does work under certain circumstances. Second, these circumstances almost never occur, especially in the modern world, especially the country that's trying to impose this kind of theoretical policy is a democracy in an age of mass media. I'll quote John Nagel, who wrote a book called Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, and is still one of the great popularizers and big advocates of counterinsurgency theory, who said, and tells many of his friends, the lessons of Malaya are that the best way to fight a counterinsurgency is on a peninsula against an ethnically distinct minority in an era before CNN was invented. So that kind of says it all. But let's take a look at this theory, which isn't just the ravings or imaginings of someone. It grows out of a particular historical bent and is, in fact, appropriate to the era in which it was revived in the United States. In the early 80s and early 90s, when a lot of the people who became generals and colonels and who are the subject of my book, including Petraeus, were rising through the ranks, the United States Army had a definition of war, and that was major combat operations. Comparable foes against one another. Soviet Union, United States, NATO, Warsaw Pact. All other kinds of conflicts, or at least conflicts against insurgents, small civil wars, that kind of thing, were called military operations other than war, M-O-O-T-W. Mutwa, it was said with a snide sneer. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time was known to at least once said, "Real men don't do mutwa." And yet the young officers coming up through the ranks in the late 80s and early 90s, where were they being deployed? They were being deployed in El Salvador, in Haiti, in Bosnia, in Somalia. The generals were telling them these weren't wars. They weren't getting combat badges for them. And yet it certainly felt like wars to them. And so as they rose through the ranks, they decided that the Army had to change, not least because they saw that these were the kinds of wars that the United States was going to be fighting in the coming years, especially as the Cold War wound to a halt. This was the kind of conflict that the politicians were going to send them to. The fact that they weren't being acknowledged as wars, being acknowledged as the kinds of wars that had to be fought in a different way from the way that you would fight a larger conflict, meant first, they weren't going to be advancing. Second, the Army was going to be proving itself irrelevant. And third, we were going to be losing a lot of these wars. So the Army had to adapt. A revolution had to be sired from within. I'm not going to go through all the details of how this community of counterinsurgency advocates came into being, but it is worth focusing on David Petraeus, who is the namesake of the subtitle. He kind of glommed onto this a bit earlier than most. He went to France right after graduating from West Point in 1974 to do parachute training, started reading a lot of French counterinsurgency literature, including a book by David Galula called Counterinsurgency Warfare, which would later become very influential here. And then when he went to, a decade later, when he went to become the assistant to the commander of Southcom, and watching all these civil wars going on in El Salvador and Nicaragua and the other places, he's saying, my God, this is really happening. This is what I was studying. And it regalvanized his efforts. Years later, when he was head of the commander of the 101st Airborne Division in Iraq, and most of you know the story of he went to Mosul and in effect put counterinsurgency in motion, and it worked. And he did it pretty much, well, not pretty much, entirely on his own, because one advantage of the time was that there was no command structure in Iraq, that basically we went into Iraq with no post-war plan, and it was deliberate. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an act of incompetence. It was deliberate. The idea was we go in, we get out. There is no post-war plan. Donald Rumsfeld wrested away control of post-war Iraq from the State Department because he didn't want there to be a post-war Iraq. But there was a post-war Iraq. And Petraeus, left out on his own in Mosul, put in place this counterinsurgency strategy, which worked quite well for about a year until he left, and then it fell apart. So he goes to Leavenworth, and one of his big goals is to write a counterinsurgency field manual so that by the time he gets rotated back to Iraq, which he knew was going to happen, he would have the imprimatur of the U.S. Army backing what he wanted to do theater-wide. Now, in the meantime, and I'm generally not a conspiracy theorist, but it's always nice when you come across things that are really conspiracies, because it's quite fun to write about. There were a lot of people like Petraeus in that sense coming along, who were seeing what was going on in Iraq, seeing that it was a disaster, having some knowledge of counterinsurgency theory and how insurgency wars are fighting, and realizing that nobody else did, and this is the way it goes. One of these people was Elliot Cohen, whom some of you might know. He teaches over here at SAIS, and he had an annual summer conference up at Basin Harbor, Vermont, where they would discuss usually how to improve the teaching of national security studies in American universities. This time he said, okay, we're going to talk about how to make Iraq a better war. He'd been over there as a Pentagon advisor, saw that it was a disaster. His son was about to be sent there as an infantry soldier. And he says, this is a disaster. I've kind of been a part of this. He had endorsed the president. He'd been endorsing invading Iraq for some time. It had actually happened, and it was turning into a complete disaster. So he goes through his Rolodex, goes through military journals, finds everybody who had written anything remotely interesting about counterinsurgency and invited them to this conference. One of them was Janine Davidson. And the pivotal thing about this conference wasn't even so much what they talked about and what they argued about. It was the fact that it existed at all. These were 30 people from different walks of life, most of whom didn't know each other until this event, and all of whom, suddenly looking around the table, realized, oh my God, it's not just me. There's this whole nascent community out there. And we can form a community. We can perhaps provide leverage for getting this really done. And they went away from this conference with a missionary zeal. In the meantime, Petraeus is in Leavenworth. And he knows quite a few of the people who are at this conference. And some of them become his inner circle, his entourage. When this conference takes place in February of 2006, the Basin Harbor thing had been the summer before, he's got his team together and they write this manual. Then Petraeus was very big on information operations, an army concept which means, the French called it less euphemistically propaganda. And the idea is that it's the minds part of hearts and minds, or maybe it's both, it's hearts and minds, but at all audiences, the people who you're fighting with and the people who need your support back home. So Petraeus invites about 150 people to this conference from all over. And the idea is, the stated reason is to vet this conference and help us write this and go over some of the points. We're going to have a discussion here. And they did a little bit of that. But the real point was to get support for it, to build support. I wasn't at this conference, but it was videotaped. And I've watched the entire videotape on DVD, which is alternately, it's fascinating in some parts and just stupor driving in other parts. Janine, I think you were there too, weren't you? Yes.
Can imagine it on DVD.
But in any event, one interesting thing about this conference, well, several interesting things, but the one I'm going to mention, is that very serious questions were raised about whether this made sense at all. There were all kinds of historical parallels drawn. The familiar ones are to Malaya, the Philippines. Many people got up and asked, are these historical examples relevant? You've got a Maoist insurgency group on the one hand, and you've got these fundamentalist jihadists on the other hand. Can you really deal with, co-opt, defeat them in the same way? And then there's a big component in counterinsurgency is legitimacy. The idea is to help make the host government legitimate. So there are a lot of discussion, well, what does legitimacy mean? I mean, is it just a Western concept? And also, is this just too hard for the army, the United States Army, to pull off. I mean, they were talking about, one part of the field manual talks about soldiers and Marines at all levels having a very thorough cultural understanding, political understanding. You know, the idea of insurgency, let's just back up for a second. The premise of it, which I think is correct in most cases, is that insurgencies grow out of social and political situations. They arise because the government in power is not satisfying certain needs. It's not governing properly with legitimacy. And so the idea of counterinsurgency is that you have to not only fight and kill and arrest the insurgents, the bad guys, but you have to help the government become a more capable government. You have to dry up the support, co-opt the causes of the insurgency. So one question that was raised by several people is, do we really know how to do this? Is this just something that's too hard to do? And another thing that was embedded in the field manual was that this was going to take a long time. The field manual is a field manual. It's for officers to read in case the politicians tell you you're going to go fight this kind of war, and they say, oh, well, let's see how to do this. But the people who are writing it wanted to send a message to the politicians. And so they couldn't do it explicitly, so they did it between the lines, saying this requires, persistent effort, considerable resources. It was like wink and nudge. If you don't want to spend 10 years doing this, don't get involved in it in the first place. But all these questions and issues were sort of finessed during the conference. The idea was to get it out there, to get it approved by the Army, and by the time Petraeus goes back, to have it be policy. So Petraeus goes into Iraq as the commander in February of 2007. By that time, the field manual was out in December of 2006. He was made commander in 2006. The surge was approved at the end of 2006, early 2007, I forget right now. And also Bush switches, he says explicitly on television, we are going to change strategy to clear, hold, and build, which was the kind of operative slogan of counterinsurgency. It means you clear an area of insurgents, then you keep guys there to hold it, and then you build services and so forth on top of that, so that by the time you withdraw, the pace is a functioning. I won't go into it now. We can go into it on questionings if you want. Each one of those four things that happened, Petraeus becoming commander, the surge being approved, the strategy being approved, none of this was accidental. All of this was a very craftily manipulated plot. I mean, I used the subtitle is David Petraeus and the Plot to Change the American Way of War. It was a plot, a very explicit plot, not necessarily a nefarious plot. Plots can be, good. It was a plot by a small group of people to get these things done and to coordinate it on time. So he gets to Iraq. Certain things are already beginning to happen. The Anbar Awakening, for example. Now, I used to think when the surge went in and the Anbar Awakening, and then, in 2007, things really did start to improve considerably. In my columns in Slate at the time, I used to say, surge had nothing to do with this. Petraeus had nothing to do with this. The Anbar Awakening was going on before he even got there. It was a Sunni initiative, not a U.S. initiative. That's what really did it. All this other stuff is coincidence. One thing that I discovered upon doing the research is that sort of right, but in a fundamental way I was wrong. Because in Anbar, the commander there, this colonel named Sean McFarland, who got this thing going, he had in fact come out of this same group as the Petraeus counterinsurgency guys. He too had come out of the social science department at West Point, which was kind of also a molding ground for this sort of thinking about war. He'd read the same kind of literature that everybody else had. He wasn't even aware of the field manual, but he was already acting it. So I think if you had an ordinary commander, a conventional commander, someone like General Casey, being out in Anbar, instead of accepting this initiative from the Sunni sheiks and knowing what to do with it and seeing that there was an opportunity here and here is the possibilities and here's how to deal with it, I think they would have just shot them just like they were shooting all bad guys. So I think it did take a certain kind of commander to exploit the conditions, to recognize and then exploit the kinds of conditions that were going on the ground. So to some extent, it actually worked in Iraq. A couple of things happened. Petraeus built on the Sunni awakening, said, well, this looks pretty good, let's extend it. And here's another thing, in counterinsurgency theory, they talk about a unified commander, one guy running everything. Petraeus decided to be that guy. And he did it in a way that I don't think anybody else would or possibly could do. For example, you all know about the Sons of Iraq, which were these turned Sunni militants that he paid to come join our side because they were getting annoyed with al-Qaeda in Iraq. He paid them out of his commander's discretionary fund. Now, the point of a commander's discretionary fund was, pay some guy to clean up the streets, maybe a local auxiliary force. He was paying militants who had been shooting at Americans 2 weeks earlier, and as far as anybody knows, might be shooting at them again 2 months hence without telling anyone in Washington that he was doing this. So it's kind of peculiar. And then another thing that he did was to bash the Shia militants in Sadr City. Before he was there, George Casey, the commander before him, had been told by Prime Minister Maliki, stay out of Sadr City. And Casey's attitude was, okay, hey, it's your country, you're a sovereign country, I'll stay out. Petraeus just went in, he just did it. And he got backing from the ambassador ahead of time, this is what we're doing. And so there were things like that were Petraeus, that is just his mode of operation. And I think this kind of freelancing got him into trouble later, but we don't need to go into that right now. Now, the thing is, when Afghanistan happens, and now I'm going to be condensing a lot because my time is running out. He came into Afghanistan, the idea was, okay, Petraeus, the miracle worker in Iraq. And by the way, even in Iraq, it was, I would argue, a tactical success, not a strategic. We still have sectarian. The key assumption was that the Iraqi government has to want to do the things that we wanted them to do, and he didn't. So, there was no settling of oil revenue among the tribes. There was no settling of Kirkuk. So while violence is at a much lower level than it was, there is still sectarian violence. It is still fundamentally an unstable state. Afghanistan, the idea was, we'll try to do the same thing. Petraeus knew that they were different countries. He knew that coin is essentially a local phenomenon. But he didn't know anything about Afghanistan. And, we all, going into new situations, tend to look at them through the prism of what we know. So what he knew was Iraq. And it just wasn't working. And my time is really short, so I'm just going to go.
You've got a little while.
5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes. At least 5 minutes.
Yeah, but I'm now going to get into Kierkegaard.
Please
I
go.
have no idea.
I'll let you know when you're running
well, I want to give
everybody
everybody a time, but well, Afghanistan, I'll just give you one. I was told by many people who worked with him in Afghanistan that every time a problem was dealt with him, he would say something like, well, in Baghdad, we did it this way. Or in Anbar, when this happened, we did this. Or in Mosul, I did this. And at one time, even in a meeting with President Karzai, he starts, well, in Iraq, we did it this way. And coming out of the room with him, one of his assistants who had been both in Iraq and in Afghanistan said, General, it might be an interesting intellectual experiment to try not to think about Iraq at all. And he said, hey, I'm working on it. So I think he tried, but in Iraq, he'd been there in 3 tours of duty. By the time he was commander, he really knew the players. He knew the levers. He knew how to do the good cop, bad cop thing with Maliki. He knew how to play tribes off of one another. And he had a very, very deep and competent intelligence officials doing this, providing him the data. There was nothing like that in Afghanistan. And in fact, he should have known this. If you go back to this book by David Galula, which he frequently would take off the shelves and read, because it is a really good book. It's a very concise book. There is a chapter called Prerequisites for a Successful Insurgency. And it has a list of what traits a country would have to be, which would make winning really most plausible for an insurgency. They included things like corrupt central government, a largely illiterate rural population, mountainous borders, a bordering country that serves as a sanctuary for the insurgency. I mean, does this add up to something? I mean, it's a portrait of Afghanistan, and in fact, Galula even draws a picture of topographically what a perfect insurgency country would look like, and you could practically do an overlay of it with Afghanistan. So he must have known this, and here's where I think, I mean, I have great admiration for certain things about General Petraeus, but there was one thing he did that I think was particularly irresponsible, I would say, and that is that, you know about the 10 meetings that President Obama had with his national security team to figure out the Iraq policy. And on this last meeting, 2 days before he gave the speech at West Point, laying out what the policy was going to be, he says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. You're going to get 33,000 more troops. We're going to try to get NATO to kick in another 7. That'll make McChrystal's 40,000. In the South and in the cities, we're going to do counterinsurgency. Otherwise, it's going to be counterterrorism. And then in 18 months, I'm going to start to pull them out. Now, can you tell me that with what I'm giving you, you'll be able to do this? You'll be able to turn around the situation so that the Afghan army can take the lead in the fight. Now, Petraeus for sure knew that this was impossible. It just wasn't going to happen in 18 months. But all the generals in that room said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And Obama, he said, now listen, I want to be clear on this. You come back in 18 months, you're not going to get any more. This is it. This is all you're going to get. So just tell me, if you say no, we'll just put in 10,000 troops and we'll up the training of the Afghan army. But if you say yes, okay, but it's not going to be any more. But everybody in that room thought that, well, we'll make this good enough so that he'll have to stay in. He'll have to give us a few more brigades or a little bit more time. And so when 18 months hence, when President Obama, almost 18 months to the day, comes out and says, okay, we're not just going to start pulling out the surge troops. They're all coming out in the next year, all 33,000. People were shocked. But what he perceived was that, look, this wasn't working. Now, he had a great benefit of having recently killed Osama bin Laden, of decimating the Taliban soldiers on the ground. So he could portray this as a victory, like, mission accomplished, so to speak. And the way he then laid out what the mission was, it was accomplished. But that wasn't why he put in 33,000 troops. It was for counterinsurgency, and that wasn't working. So I guess the real, and then a year later, Obama decides to pull back entirely. And we're not going to get rid of counterinsurgency as an idea entirely. We're going to keep alive the lessons. But the Army and the Marines are hereby ordered not when they're planning, they shall not size their forces for large-scale, prolonged stability operations, which is code word for this kind of population-centric counterinsurgency. And we're going back to what was kind of the small footprint kind of wars. Yes, there's a war on terror. Yes, there are insurgents, but we will fight them with very small footprints, drones, commandos, aiding, training other countries to do their own counterinsurgency, but we've kind of gotten out of the game. And I think maybe in a strategic way, this is a little bit unsatisfying because it's not this unified picture of the world and here's what we're doing about it. It's kind of it's kind of a half measure of how you tackle this problem, but it may very well be that that's all that the United States can do in these situations. The questions that were haunting people going back to the Counterinsurgency Field Manual Conference, are these historical parallels relevant? Is this something that the United States, is it something that the Army can do? Is it something that the nation can support? Is this something that, ultimately speaking, will work? And what about the country that we're aiding? We kind of have to have common interests for this to work. And do we? usually we don't. I mean, that's the big thing about Afghanistan. The real problem was Karzai didn't want to reform. His method of staying in power almost defies reform. He has to maintain this kind of criminal network. Otherwise, his power base falls apart. So that's what I think my final conclusion was, is that counterinsurgency became this sort of very good idea and a very smart idea. It appeals to intellectual generals, officers. I would have to say it also appeals to quasi-intellectual reporters. I think a lot of reporters became very entranced with this because, you would talk with a guy like, say, Tommy Franks, and you would come away, I'm sure Spencer will agree with me, thinking, Jesus Christ, what kind of operation is the Army that a guy like this can become a 4-star general? And then you go talk with like a Petraeus or a McChrystal, and you say, God, this guy, he understands history, he has a strategic way of thinking, he knows about politics, maybe this guy can do this. And I think we all kind of, there's an old rule, there's an old saying that in war the enemy has a vote. Well, the ally also has a vote, and the situation has an even bigger vote. And so the big idea might be not so much what your strategy is going into it as what you're getting into. So, thanks.